Also uses the 2 out of 3 rule. That is the biggest hurdle for anybody who sees, bad choice of word, believes that it might be time for them to move from signed English or PSE to a more grammatically correct form of English. Getting over the 2 out of 3 rule is the whole picture, really. The 2 out of 3 rule is the kind of thing where if, for example, you say you are a mean person, oh, they must be back. You are a mean person, and I mean that the definition is blah, blah, blah. So, in other words, you don't worry about what the conceptual sign is. This is only difficult for those of us who used to sign conceptually. Students don't have any trouble with it at all. And students who acquire it as their first language don't have any trouble with it at all. Students who, as was so nicely put in Aldine last week, which is a suburb of Houston, so August, we just show up and we sign this way, and the kids go, whoa, what'd you do this summer? Yeah, there's going to be some transition time there, and there's bilingual ways of using one sign and then using another sign that are useful to deal with that. It's not the, the Aldine teachers will certainly not be the first teachers to have that experience. They have Austin and Plano and El Paso and many colleagues in this state that have already gone through those changes with their students and would have lots to share about student reactions and how the methodology of how they actually did that. But that is, the 2 out of 3 rule is the biggest hurdle in using signing exact English or C2. Another thing about C1 and C2 that many people don't often remember is that they were invented by deaf people, in that there were deaf people on the teams. There were also hearing people on those teams, but it wasn't something that hearing people did once again to deaf people. There were deaf people involved, and still are, in the case of C2, still are deaf people involved. I have always used a lot of overheads in my talks, and I'd like to read you some comments from a speech and language pathologist who commented on a workshop that I had done once. I think this was when I worked in Nebraska, but I'm really not sure who wrote this to me. One would think that as a speech and language pathologist, just a second. One would think that as a speech and language pathologist, I would have already grasped the importance of providing complete language stimulation, and that's complete language is Barb Luetke talk for grammatically correct English. I have provided and expected complete use of C2 when working on syntactic goals and objectives. But when concentrating on specific semantic or pragmatic goals, or when engaged in spontaneous conversation, I did not provide a complete language model. I omitted endings, articles, conjunctions, tense markers, and even some verbs, such as is, are, and do. In my mind, communicating the concept and obtaining the appropriate response was of primary importance, little caring how completely I communicated in the process. It occurred to me sometime amid overheads that my very inconsistency of language production was one of the perpetuating causes for the language delays and disorders I was trying to remediate. And for as volatile as our field is, I really think that the people who are trying to change their signing to a more grammatical complete English really need to be commended just for this reason. I mean, we've all learned to sign. We like the way we sign. It's hard for us to change the way we sign, and there is this sort of thing that we face where we kind of realize it doesn't make sense not to sign complete English, and yet it's just difficult to make that 2 out of 3 rule jump a lot of times. In the foreword of the C2 dictionary, the newest edition is a foreword that I wrote, and it chronologizes the C2 research that we had to date at that time. That was the book, that kept telling us for 5 years it'd be out in the fall, and 5 years later it came out, so it's not maybe as up to date. Basically, for C2, we don't have as much research as maybe everybody would like, especially the people who criticize C2, but there is an awful lot of research there. And so rather than go through that, which time doesn't permit, just so you know, there's a resource for it. For C2, I have just a short clip from the Modern Sign Press company, and maybe you could go ahead and show that.
Legislation like this through had he been reelected. You need to realize.
Metaphorical or higher meaning. And you could say it more simply, they are symbols of something.
This is an English class.
Okay, that's probably enough of that. Now, I have want to also clarify something else about these languages or systems. If it was only that all we had to do is get everybody to sign a certain way, and then everybody would not need deaf education and we wouldn't have jobs, that'd probably be a real happy thought. But fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how burned out you feel at this very moment, that's not the situation. Putting my parent hat on, I have these two deaf girls, and one of them you could very easily look at and say, geez, this kid's been in a signed English for a couple years, and then signing exact English for most of her school year. She'll start 6th grade this fall. Kid's got great English. She represented her class in the school spelling bee in 4th grade. She spoke with me in several different countries this year. I call her the Oprah of deafness. She's pretty, she loves language. She's interested in language. Fine. I also have another daughter, Marcy, who came to this country when she was 4 from Bulgaria and was raised in an orphanage, did not sign at all, did not speak, had no equipment, was mute for a year even after she came into this stellar signing English environment, and still has significant language delay. I don't think there's anything disordered about her language. Marcy actually represents many more children who are deaf or hard of hearing than Marcy does, or than Mary Pat does, even though she came from Bulgaria. Many of our students have a very late start into school because they're in the wrong program, because they're in rural Kansas, because their families don't know any better, or aren't around services, or lots of reasons. And even given a very consistent homeschool environment that many students don't have, even given siblings and parents who sign, Marcy still experiences that 2-year language gap like many of the students that we serve. Between 1st and 2nd grade, Marcy was tested on the Gates-McGinnity reading test that was on a handout that we had from Barbara Shermer. I was kind of coming in and out, so I'm not sure if she actually really talked about it, but I like that test because it has both a vocabulary and a comprehension. And between 1st and 2nd grade, Marcy made a year's growth in a year's time as measured by that formal test using hearing norms and on both vocabulary and comprehension. And from 2nd grade to 3rd grade, she did the same thing in comprehension. Interesting, and that's all the higher we've gotten with Marcy. She'll go into 4th grade this year. Her vocabulary made a year's growth in a year's time from 1st to 2nd grade also, and from 2nd to 3rd grade. And then when she was tested as a 3rd grader, she only gained about 3 months in vocabulary. So now this is a kid who's got all the tree, forest, wood, orchard, jungle stuff, and some of the other factors that I mentioned, and still is like many other deaf children, she is experiencing a lot lower vocabulary age than are her same age peers. And I tell you all this because it's not just a methodology, and I certainly don't want you to walk out of here and think, oh, well, you know, all we have to do is get everybody to sign this way or that way. We still have a lot of work to do in our field. There's still plenty for us to do. In case you were thinking of, you know, computer electronics or something, I hope you'll stay in deaf ed. And it's hard to present a talk like this without showing some kind of bias. So I think it's also my responsibility to say, you know, I live the bias, and I still see a great place for deaf teachers in my children's lives.